In book after book, throughout the Hebrew Bible, it is by miracles that God makes himself known to his chosen people, inspiring them, protecting them, and on occasion, destroying their enemies. Why then does the Bible never use the word miracle in describing these spectacular events? Are the miracles of the Bible merely stories, or did they actually occur? And can they be explained scientifically?
Plague number 1, the Nile turning to blood? Well, it's not literal blood. The Nile turns red, and the red is the crimson tide, the red algae, carrying the anthrax bacterium.
Why is Moses, perhaps the greatest worker of miracles in the Hebrew Bible, punished by God for miraculously drawing water from a rock? If miracles are so integral and glorious a part of the Bible, why is magic forbidden? And what is the distinction between magic and miracle? Why did the time of miracles draw to an end? Why does God no longer make his presence known by direct intervention? Or does he? These are but a few of the mysteries of the Bible. Over 3,000 years ago, the people of Israel suffer in their Egyptian bondage, slaves of a tyrannical Pharaoh. As conditions grow ever worse for the Israelites, they cry out for relief and are heard by God. He will free them through signs and wonders. He chooses Moses to lead his people, revealing this role to him by speaking from a bush that seems to burn, but miraculously is not consumed by the flames rising from it. Soon after, God tells Moses that he and his brother Aaron must go to mighty Pharaoh to demand freedom for the chosen people. But will Pharaoh receive them?
If Pharaoh says to you, "Identify yourselves by a miracle," then tell Aaron to take his staff and throw it down in front of Pharaoh, and it will become a snake. Exodus 7:9.
Aaron performs the wondrous transformation, but Pharaoh is contemptuous. His magicians easily duplicate this feat.
There is an Egyptian conjuring trick on record. It's where the enchanter has a snake that he has hypnotized. And in its hypnotic state, the snake is rigid. And then when he touches the tail of the snake becomes pliable again and wakes up and moves.
But Pharaoh's satisfaction is shaken by what happens next, something his magicians cannot duplicate or explain.
Each one of them threw down his staff, and they became snakes. But Aaron's staff swallowed theirs. Exodus 7, 12.
The snake of the Israelites swallowing the snakes of the Egyptians is clearly a miracle, and a warning Pharaoh would do well to heed, but he does not. The people of Israel remain slaves of Egypt. Now God demonstrates his power and his wrath with a miracle that for the Egyptians is a devastating calamity. He orders Moses to touch the Nile with his staff. Instantly, the mother of all rivers, which nourishes Egyptian civilization, turns to blood. Despite this horrifying spectacle, Pharaoh still refuses to free the Israelites. Again, God strikes, and Egypt is overrun by a grotesque infestation of frogs. Still, Pharaoh will not relent. And so God sends disaster after escalating disaster to ravage Egypt. Insect armies pillage the land, leveling crops. Lethal hailstorms torment people and livestock. A deadly disease races through the cattle herds. The people themselves suffer and die a torturous death from excruciating boils. Finally, the daytime sky turns black. With the plagues, the Lord attacks not just Pharaoh and his people, but their gods, including Osiris, the god of the Nile, Geb, god of the land, and their supreme deity, Re, god of the sun. And now the 10th and last plague attacks the Egyptians' god on earth, Pharaoh himself. He is considered divine. So too is his firstborn son, the heir to the throne. Pharaoh's son dies, as does the firstborn child of every Egyptian. Did these plagues actually occur, or are they merely stories, invented many years later?
So biblical writers, let's say, were very interested in the idea of miracle, because miracles are a way to convince human beings, to convince the people of Israel that God is acting, that God is interested in them.
Modern investigators believe the plagues may very well have occurred, perhaps as manifestations of anthrax, a deadly disease common in marshy areas.
Plague number 1, the Nile turning to blood. Well, it's not literal blood. The Nile turns red. And the red is the crimson tide, the red algae, carrying the anthrax bacterium. One of the first things the anthrax-laden algae will do is it'll kill the fish. Now, as most folks know, frogs lay eggs by the tens of thousands. There are no longer any natural predators for those millions and millions of frogs' eggs. And so the natural result is that they hatch in vast numbers. They denude the banks of the river of their natural food supplies, and soon they die in vast numbers. The next natural link within the ecosystem will be the gnats and flies that consume the bodies of dead animals. The cattle, perhaps bitten by these insects, begin to perish of the anthrax disease. Now, anthrax is characterized by boils on the skin, infectious boils, and lesions in the lungs. And so eventually this plague on cattle leads to boils on human beings, and eventually perhaps killing vast numbers of Egyptians.
But if the plagues are purely natural events, what is the explanation for one particular significant detail?
The one that makes me stop and think deeply is the death of the firstborn. All the other 9 plagues, they come together in a series, but the death of the firstborn leaves me saying that must be a miracle. What disease would strike down just a boy or a girl who was the first out of, say, 3 children or 5 children?
With the death of his son, the anguished Pharaoh finally relents. The people of Israel are finally free to go to the land promised them by God. For many scholars, even if the deaths of the firstborn can someday be explained scientifically, the plagues are made miraculous by their occurrence at just this moment in history.
There are attempts to explain away the occurrence of the 10 plagues as just a luck of timing. But we can clearly see God's presence in the remarkable conjunction of events that liberated this tiny, powerless people from the most mighty empire in the world at the time.
As the Israelites, freed by Pharaoh, begin their arduous trek to the Promised Land, they are guided by miraculous signs from God.
The Lord went in front of them in a pillar of cloud by day to lead them along the way, and in a pillar of fire by night to give them light. Exodus 13:21.
All of a sudden, they are free. There is no authority there. They are in the wilderness. And you have to show them that there is somebody who leads them. This is God who leads them. So the pillar of fire and the pillar of cloud are the symbols of God's presence.
But the people of Israel are in grave danger, because Pharaoh's grief has given way to rage. He commands his army, led by 600 chariots, to race after the fleeing slaves and recapture them. The Israelites are trapped, their way blocked by an impassable sea.
Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it, that the Israelites may go into the sea on dry ground." Exodus 14:15.
Wondrously, the waters part, and thus the children of Israel cross to safety. But the pursuing Egyptians are not far behind. Again, the Lord tells Moses to raise his staff. Now the sea rushes back, and the Egyptians are swept to their deaths. Perhaps no other story in history has given rise to as much analysis, speculation, and controversy. In 1985, the miracle of the Red Sea still made headline news. To this day, a sensational explanation for what happened at the Red Sea consumes Egyptologist Dr. Hans Gödicke. The former chairman of Near Eastern Studies at Johns Hopkins University, he has spent 30 years unearthing scientific evidence which he feels proves that the miracle is anchored in historical reality.
So I would say the Bible does reflect historical events. They are not verbatim, but there is an historical nucleus, and for me as a historian, the job is to get to the nucleus.
Dr. Gödicke believes the pillars of fire and cloud which guided the Israelites rose from a volcano on the Mediterranean island of Thera, some 290 miles away. Modern volcanologists calculate that the volcano on Thera spewed columns of fire and smoke more than 50 miles into the sky. At that height, the Bible's pillar of cloud and pillar of fire could easily be seen as far away as Egypt. The same volcano, says Dr. Gödecke, also caused the parting of the waters, not of the Red Sea, as is commonly believed, but of a shallow lake called the Sea of Reeds. Although much of what Dr. Gödecke proposes is controversial, all scholars agree about the Sea of Reeds.
The body of water that Israel crossed is not called the Red Sea by the Hebrew Bible. It's called the Sea of Reeds.
The Sea of Reeds is thought to be one of a string of shallow lakes lying 175 miles northwest of the Red Sea. The fleeing Israelites may well have planned to simply go around it, until they realized the Egyptian army was in pursuit. In an attempt to establish a defensive position, according to Dr. Gödecke, they encamped on relatively high ground. The Egyptians, preparing for the assault, lay below them. Then the distant, smoldering volcano, which had produced the columns of smoke and fire, exploded. Volcanologists estimate that a 16 cubic mile mass of earth, rock, and lava was hurled miles into the sky. When it fell, it created a monstrous tidal wave. A wave scientists have calculated exploded out of the Mediterranean and swept southeast across the Nile Delta. They estimate that the wave covered the nearly 300 miles in less than an hour. It hit Egypt at the exact point where Gödecke believes Pharaoh's troops were camped.
As the Egyptians fled before it, the Lord tossed the Egyptians into the sea. The waters returned and covered the chariots and the chariot drivers, the entire army of Pharaoh. Exodus 14:27.
Because the Israelites are still encamped on the high ground, they are unharmed, free to resume their journey to the Promised Land. The Exodus story was not written down for almost 1,000 years after it occurred. Dr. Gödecke believes that in those 10 centuries of telling and retelling, the gigantic wall of water which swept away the Pharaoh's army and then receded became the parting of the seas, as recounted in the Bible. Some critics say that the volcanic eruptions do not coincide with the accepted dates for the Exodus. But again, whatever the cause, it is the precise timing of the receding and returning waters that marks them as miracles. God's direct intervention in the history of his chosen people. The great Exodus, which begins with these miracles, will end with one having tragic consequences for the worker of miracles, Moses. Early in their great journey deep in the desert wilderness, the people of Israel find themselves desperately short of water. At God's direction, Moses strikes a rock with his staff, and water pours forth. Nearly 40 years later, as the Exodus nears its end, the people again find themselves without water. This time, God tells Moses not to strike a rock, but to speak to it. Perhaps acting out of impatience, Moses disobeys God, and instead of speaking to the rock, strikes it. Again, abundant water pours forth, and the people are saved. But for what seems a minor transgression, Moses will suffer a terrible punishment.
Because you have not firmly trusted in me so as to vindicate my holiness in the eyes of the people of Israel, you shall not lead this assembly into the promised land. Numbers 20:12.
Moses is denied anything more than a tantalizing glimpse of the promised land. He will never actually set foot upon it. The story contains a powerful warning for humanity.
When Moses strikes the rock instead of speaking to it, there's very definitely an attempt on his part to step in and present himself as the miracle worker. God takes it as a direct assault upon his own holiness, upon his own character as the giver of miracle. And so here Moses himself is crossing the line from miracle worker to magician, and God will not permit that.
Miracle is the act of God. Miracle is an expression of God's just rule. You see how the emphasis is switched from God to humans when we move from miracle to magic.
The Hebrew Bible, filled with rules and laws for the people of Israel, contains no clearer prohibitions than the ones forbidding the practice of magic.
There must not be found among you anyone practicing divination or soothsaying, or observing omens, applying sorcery, a charmer, a medium, wizard, or necromancer. For all who do these things are offensive to the Lord. Deuteronomy 18:10.
In the Bible story, magic is not an equal. Nothing, after all, can equal God's power. But it is a dangerous rival. It's a snare, according to the ancient texts.
Lower levels of the population, where there's a lot of superstition, you will get people turning to magic if the crops fail or something's happened at home. They might well turn to magic if their faith is not strong enough in their official God.
Israel's first king, King Saul, is dutiful in killing or driving out those who claim magical powers. But strangely, it is Saul himself who will seek out a shadowy figure known only as the Witch of Endor.
One of the biggest mysteries of the Bible is the Witch of Endor. What in the world is going on in this text? It's very hard to know.
This strange, dark story is set in a time of war. Once again, the very existence of the people of Israel is at stake. This time, the enemy is the Philistines. The Philistines assemble what seems to be an overwhelming force on the plain of Shunem, 60 miles north of present-day Jerusalem. They are prepared to crush the Israelites in a battle almost certain to occur the next day.
When Saul saw the army of the Philistines, he was afraid, and his heart trembled greatly. 1 Samuel 28:5.
Saul turns to God, but he receives no reply, no sign nor word.
There are a number of stories that talk about why Saul lost God's favor, but I think they're all summed up in Samuel's words to him, that he became small in his own eyes. He no longer acted like a king. He was petty and hoarded power and felt vengeful.
Distraught, Saul defies God and does that which is forbidden to him and all his people.
Then Saul said to his servants, "Seek out for me a woman who is a medium, so that I may go to her and inquire of her." His servants said to him, "There is a medium at Endor." 1 Samuel 28:7.
This is classic Saul-type behavior. He can never really obey God fully. He's always mixing his own stuff in it. And here's the culmination of it, trying to get God's will through a prophet by means of a medium. Classic Saul-type disobedience.
Here, not far from the present city of Haifa, archaeologists believe the village of Endor once stood, a place which will always be haunted by the mysterious witch of Endor. She dwelt, tradition says, in a murky cave in these rocky slopes. Furtively, in disguise, King Saul makes his way to Endor and persuades the witch to call God's prophet Samuel back from the dead. Perhaps because such practices are forbidden, the Bible does not describe how the witch summoned Samuel, but suddenly his ghost appears. In awe, King Saul bows down before the apparition, then asks what he must do to save himself and his people. Samuel responds with a chilling and final prophecy.
The Lord will give Israel, along with you, into the hands of the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons shall be with me. 1 Samuel 28:19.
Less than 24 hours later, on the battlefield at Shunem, the once great King Saul, selected by God himself to be the first king of the Israelites, lies dead, impaled upon his own sword, as foretold by the spirit of Samuel. A puzzling question prevails. Knowing he was going to be killed and the battle lost, why didn't Saul withdraw to fight another day?
On the one hand, Saul made a mistake, a terrible mistake. He has to die. On the other hand, the Bible wants you actually to like Saul, to appreciate Saul, even to adore Saul. He made a mistake, yet he's a king, and he knows how to approach his death, how to face his death, and he does it in a very dignified way.
For thousands of years, the Witch of Endor has intrigued readers of the Bible. Was this a hoax, or was the witch a genuine medium? Was she human at all?
Many theories have been attempted, proposed, among them that it's a demon. Another, that the witch is merely a manipulator, a fraud. Another, that Samuel really is called up by her power.
To some, it is clear that God is using the witch, and Samuel's appearance is a miracle after all.
The Witch of Endor story is both magical and miraculous. Magical in that we have a medium consulted by Saul. Miraculous, though, in that God preemptively strikes, so to speak, and allows Samuel the prophet to speak a final oracle from the grave, as it were.
For all the speculation this story has inspired, the fact remains that we know almost nothing of the witch. She appears only once in the Bible, inhabiting less than a single page, and then disappears, never to be mentioned or referred to again. Perhaps this very obscurity is the key to the meaning of her story.
I think that the fact that there is only one such story in the Bible means that the Bible doesn't want to spend a lot of time telling us about the ills and the charlatanism and the fakery of magic. It just wants to say, look, here was somebody who was so desperate he was driven to magic, it didn't help him. Stay away from it.
The Witch of Endor will personify for all time the boundary between the light and the dark, between miracle and magic, a boundary humans are not to cross. Despite the Bible's prohibitions against rituals and spells, in the years following the death of Saul, the people of Israel persist in the practice of forbidden magic. Almost always, this magic is associated with the worship of a myriad of pagan gods, rather than the one true God of Israel, the God of Abraham and Moses. Then, approximately 200 years after Saul, a new prophet appears who will strike a fatal blow against the pagan gods. His name is Elijah. In Hebrew, Elijah means, "The Lord is my God." Elijah's unique role is foreshadowed in part by his having no apparent connection to any who have come before him.
Most people in the Hebrew Bible are introduced by means of the patronym, that is the name of their father. So it's so-and-so, son of so-and-so. We don't have that for Elijah. All we have is that he's identified as Elijah the Tishbite. Now, Tishbite might mean settler. So here we have this guy arriving with no patronym, no family identity, but arriving full-grown as a prophet.
Early in his story, Elijah is clearly identified as one through whom God works miracles. At a place called Zarephath, he visits a widow and her son. They are on the verge of starvation, but Elijah asks for food, for this is what God has directed him to do. The widow, though fearful and protecting, gives him what little she has, and is rewarded with a miracle of never-ending abundance.
So she, he, and her household ate for a long time. The jar of flour was never empty, nor did the jug of oil give out, in accordance with the word of the Lord spoken through Elijah. 1 Kings 17:15.
Soon after, God works an even greater miracle through Elijah. The widow's son falls gravely ill, so ill he seems without life. Gently, Elijah takes the child from his mother's lap and lays him on his bed.
Stretching himself over the child 3 times, he prayed to the Lord and said, "O Lord my God, let now the life of this child return to him." The Lord heard the prayer of Elijah. The life of the child returned. The woman said to Elijah, "Now by this I know you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord coming from your lips is true." 1 Kings 17:21.
Affirming the widow's belief in the power of the God of Israel is only a precursor to a mission of historic proportions. Elijah will restore the faith of a nation. He has emerged at a critical time in the history of Israel, for Israel is now ruled by King Ahab and his queen Jezebel. A powerful, scheming woman, Jezebel worships the pagan god Baal and promotes his cult among the people. Monotheism, the worship of one God, seems gravely threatened.
Monotheism is something that we live with, and we are trained since we are born to believe that there is just one God, one and only God. But for people in that times, in the ancient times, they knew about many gods. We know about Baal, we know about Asherah, we know about many other gods. And the people of Israel were familiar with these traditions. And the monotheistic idea is a revolutionary idea. And you have to prove it again and again.
Elijah challenges King Ahab to assemble the people of Israel on Mount Carmel to witness a spectacular contest between magic and miracle, between Baal and the one true God. On one side stand the 450 prophets of Baal. Against them, a single man, God's prophet Elijah. The crowd waits in charged silence as sacrifices are placed on 2 different altars. Now, the prophets of Baal call on their god to ignite their altar. The prophets of Baal pray and dance and plead for hours, but their altar remains unlit and cold. Elijah cannot resist taunting them.
Shout louder, for he is a god. He is in conversation, or he has gone out. He's on a trip, or perhaps he is asleep and must be awakened. So they shouted more loudly and cut themselves with swords and lances, as they were accustomed to do until the blood ran out over them. 1 Kings 18:27.
Now Elijah orders his own altar to be soaked with jars of water. Then he calls upon the Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, to ignite it.
Then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the offering, the wood, the stones, and the dust. The people fell on their faces and said, "The Lord indeed is God. The Lord indeed is God." 1 Kings 18:38.
One of the remarkable passages of the Bible is that after there is this great miracle and the prophets of Baal are scattered, instead of the Israelites saying, "Wow, what a phenomenal miracle," what they say is, "The Lord is God." In other words, the miracle brought them not to wonder about the miracle, it brought them to faith in the Lord.
The episode ends in blood. At Elijah's command, the prophets of Baal are rounded up so that Elijah personally can slaughter them all. Ahab's queen, Jezebel, insane with fury, swears that within 24 hours, Elijah will lie dead. Elijah flees into the wilderness, and here God directs him to anoint a successor. Soon after Elijah fulfills this command, a miraculous chariot of fire appears, and Elijah is carried off into the heavens. Many readers of the Bible believe this ascent does not mark Elijah's death and is merely the precursor to another, greater miracle, for which the world still waits.
The reason in the Bible why Elijah doesn't die, at least according to the Jewish tradition, is that it is Elijah who will return to announce the coming of the Messiah.
Thus, the story of Elijah keeps the age of prophets and the time of miracles alive even today. A reminder that the divine is ever present.
And there is a strain of belief that says that not only did Elijah not die, but Elijah is here among us and has been for thousands of years, and that the person you talk to, your neighbor, the person at the next desk at work, the person who pulls up next to you at a red light, any of those people could be Elijah, ready for you to treat them in such a way that you will evoke the coming of the Messiah, who could come at any time.
To many who study it, the Bible, filled with signs and wonders, is itself miraculous.
Well, you know what's the biggest mystery for me? What's the biggest miracle for me? Biblical literature. Literature that was written 3,000 years ago, and yet it's much better, much more sophisticated, much more artistic than any other piece of literature I know.
What is miraculous about it is that that bridge was given us between heaven and earth. That somehow in our struggles with God we helped create that bridge, and that it still serves thousands of years later as a means by which human beings and God can contact one another and understand one another.
And yet nowhere in this miraculous book of miracles, the Hebrew Bible, does the word miracle occur.
So there is no word in biblical literature for miracle. The word nes, which we use in later strata of the Hebrew language, does not appear in the Bible in that meaning.
Many believe this is because God rules all of nature at all times. Both the extraordinary and the ordinary are his doing, proof he made the world and is the one true God.
I think that the greatest miracle in the very beginning of the Bible, the creation of the world, that's God's biggest act, that's the greatest miracle. Look, all other miracles are like an additional brush stroke of the painter who completes and corrects his painting.
In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God said, "Let the waters under the sky be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." Then God said, "Let the earth put forth vegetation." Let the earth bring forth living creatures of every kind. God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. Genesis chapter 1.
There's a miracle in the rising of every sun. There's a miracle in the lapping of every wave on the shore. There's a miracle in every star-sown night. The question is not whether they're miracles, but whether, because those miracles are with us every day, our senses become dulled and we don't see that what God has done for us is astonishing and extraordinarily beautiful.
And yet our time is clearly different from that in which the stories of the Bible occurred. Why does God no longer speak to prophets or communicate with humanity through extraordinary events? Why, some ask, does God seem sometimes to hide from us?
As a great rabbi once said, it's not that God abandoned us, but that God teaches us faith the way a parent teaches a child to walk. At first, you stand with the child, but as the child gets older, you move further and further away in the hope that the child will learn to walk to you. I think God eventually started to give us more and more room. God stepped back. I think God said to us, look, you know the basic rules now. Now you have to be grown-ups. And that's hard, because then you don't have God's presence at your right hand. But it also is necessary for human beings if we're ever going to be more than children.